banker disguises himself as a customer and tests his own bank. What he discovers shocks him. Richard Thompson adjusted the dark cap on his head and took a deep breath before pushing the glass door of the branch. After 15 years building his regional banking network, something deeply troubled him about the customer satisfaction reports. Dressed in a faded grey sweatshirt and simple jeans, he barely recognized himself in the door's reflection. The 45-year-old businessman had decided to find out for himself what was happening in his branches. Complaints had been increasing, but profit numbers kept growing. "Good morning, sir," greeted the security guard at the entrance, barely looking at him. Richard nodded and walked toward the waiting chairs. The smell of air conditioning and the noise of the self-service machines were familiar, but today everything felt different. He was on the other side of the counter. An elderly woman with grey hair approached the information desk, leaning on a cane. "Miss, I need to use the restroom, please," she said in a shaky voice. The receptionist looked up from her computer screen with an irritated expression. "Ma'am, the restroom is only for premium customers. Do you have a premium account?" "I've had an account here for 20 years, dear. But it's not premium. There's a public restroom in the square, 2 blocks from here." Richard felt his blood boil. Was that his policy? Since when did this rule exist? He stood up, but controlled the urge to reveal himself. He needed to understand the extent of the problem. The elderly woman sighed and slowly walked away, dragging her feet. Richard watched until she disappeared into the busy streets of Cincinnati, where his main branch was located. "Next," shouted one of the tellers. Richard saw a middle-aged man approach the counter with an envelope in his hands. "Good morning, I need to renegotiate my loan. I've been unemployed for 3 months and ID and proof of income." The teller cut in without looking at him. "That's what I'm trying to explain, miss. I don't have proof because I'm unemployed, but I can pay a smaller installment until I find another job. Without proof of income, we can't renegotiate. Next, but I just need more time. I can pay..." "Sir, you're holding up the line. If you don't have the required documents, you need to step aside." Richard clenched his fists. This man was clearly a desperate family man, and he was being treated like a nuisance. When had his employees become so cold? Determined to test the system fully, Richard walked to the new accounts desk. "Good afternoon. I'd like to open a checking account," he said, keeping his tone simple. The manager, a woman around 40 with sleek hair and a blue suit, looked him up and down. Her badge read, "Jennifer Wilson, Manager." "What kind of transactions do you plan to make?" she asked, clearly uninterested. "I receive my pension, about $1,200 a month. Sometimes my daughter deposits some help." The disdain on Jennifer's face was immediate. "Look, sir, what was your name again?" Richard Miller." "Mr. Richard, our checking account has a minimum fee of $80 monthly. For a pension of $1,200, perhaps you should look for a bank more suited to your profile. There's a credit union around the corner." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He was being kicked out of his own bank for appearing poor. "But I read on your website that you offer a free social account for retirees," he insisted. "Oh, that account is very limited. No checkbook. Only 2 withdrawals a month, no credit card. You won't like it. You're better off looking elsewhere." "I'd like to learn about this social account." Richard held his ground. Jennifer sighed dramatically and took a number. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Number 346. You can sit over there and wait. It'll take about 2 hours because it's busy today." Richard took the number and headed to the chairs. 2 hours to serve a retiree who wanted a free account. He looked around and noticed there were only 8 people in line, with 5 teller windows open. During the wait, Richard watched scenes that left him increasingly outraged. An elderly lady asked about a loan and was directed to a young man who introduced himself as a financial consultant. Within 10 minutes, he had convinced her to sign up for life insurance, a credit card, and a personal loan. "You'll be much more protected this way, ma'am," the young man said, while the older woman signed papers without fully understanding what she was agreeing to. Later, Richard saw the same woman leave the bank in tears, talking on the phone. "Dear, I don't know what happened. I just came to ask about a small loan. and now I have to pay $300 a month for who knows what. Richard discreetly pulled out his phone and started recording. He was documenting the destruction of his own values. A young man, probably around 28, approached an older woman struggling to walk. She had dropped some papers and was trying to pick them up. "Let me help you, Mrs." and he said, gathering the documents. "Thank you, son. What a polite young man." "Brandon," Jennifer shouted from her desk. "You're not here to do charity work. Get back to your station." The young man, whose badge read Brandon Cooper, flushed with embarrassment but helped the woman sit before returning to work. Richard noticed Brandon was different from the other employees. He explained things patiently, didn't push unnecessary products, and treated everyone with respect. But every act of kindness earned him a scolding from Jennifer. At 4 in the afternoon, it was finally Richard's turn. "Next, number 346. He approached the teller, who barely looked up from her screen. "ID," she said, holding out her hand. Richard handed over a fake ID he'd arranged for the test. She typed in the details quickly. "Income? Retirement? 1,200. Proof? I didn't bring it. Can I bring it tomorrow?" The miss huffed. "No proof, no account. Next." "But the manager said I could open a basic account." "The manager says a lot of things. No income proof, no account. Next." Richard felt the humiliation firsthand. The man who signed million-dollar contracts was being treated like a nuisance over a missing piece of paper. "Please, it's just a simple account." "Sir, you're being difficult. Security." The same guard who had greeted him at the entrance approached with a scowl. "Is there a problem here?" "This gentleman is disrupting service," the teller said. "Come on, sir. Better try another bank," the guard said, putting a hand on Richard's arm. Richard was being thrown out of his own bank. Anger and humiliation swirled in his chest, but he had to keep up the act. "Sorry, didn't mean to cause trouble," he murmured, walking out with his head down. Outside, Richard leaned against the wall of the neighboring building, trying to process what he'd just experienced. In a single afternoon, he'd witnessed elderly people being humiliated, customers being tricked, and employees being reprimanded for showing humanity. But the investigation was just beginning. The next day, Richard returned to the bank with the documents. This time, he managed to speak with Brandon, who helped him kindly. "Mr. Richard, right? Yesterday you tried to open an account." "That's right, son. I brought the papers." Brandon analyzed the documents and started the process of opening the business account. During the service, Richard noticed the young man genuinely cared. "Do you live alone, sir?" asked Brandon. "I do. Why?" "It's just that there are some important precautions for retirees. For example, never sign anything without fully understanding it. And if someone calls offering a loan or credit card, always be skeptical." "Thanks for the advice, young man." "Brandon!" came Jennifer's shout again. "You're taking way too long with this client." "I'm almost done," Brandon replied, but kept explaining the account details to Richard. As Richard was leaving, he overheard a conversation that chilled him. "Mrs. Margaret, you need to think about the future," Jennifer was saying to a white-haired woman Richard recognized immediately. It was Margaret Wilson, his fourth-grade teacher, the woman who had taught Richard and hundreds of other children to read at the public school in Cincinnati. He hadn't seen her in over 20 years. "But I already have savings, dear Mrs., Margaret said in that sweet voice Richard remembered so well. "Savings don't earn anything these days. You need to invest that money. I have the perfect product for you right here." Richard hid behind a pillar to listen more closely. "I don't understand much about investing," Mrs. Margaret said. "That's exactly why you need professional help. I'll put all your savings into this fund. In a year, you'll have much more money." "But what if it goes wrong?" "Mrs. Margaret, trust me, it's never gone wrong. It's a guaranteed investment." Richard knew that was a lie. Jennifer was pushing a high-risk fund on a 72-year-old woman who knew nothing about investments. "Brandon," Jennifer called again, "come here and prepare the papers for Mrs. Margaret to sign." Brandon approached reluctantly, and Richard saw the discomfort on the young man's face. "Mrs. Margaret," Brandon said quietly, "are you sure you want to invest all your savings? It's very risky." "Brandon," Jennifer snapped, "you're not here to give unsolicited advice. Do what I told you or you're fired." "Sorry, Mrs. Margaret," Brandon murmured, preparing the documents. Richard almost revealed himself right then. Seeing his old teacher being deceived was unbearable. But he needed to understand the full extent of the problem before acting. Mrs. Margaret signed the papers with trembling hands, trusting Jennifer's word. Richard discreetly followed her to the exit. "Mrs. Margaret," he called out on the sidewalk. She turned, adjusting her glasses. "Yes? Don't you recognize me? I'm Richard, your fourth-grade student, Richard Thompson." Her eyes lit up. "Richard, my goodness, how you've grown. What a handsome man you've become." Richard felt his eyes well up. Even after decades, Mrs. Margaret still had that affectionate way with her former students. "How have you been?" "Just fine, son. Retired 10 years now, living my quiet life. And you? Married? Any children?" "I have a daughter, Mrs. Margaret, and I work in business." "That's wonderful. I always knew you'd go far. You were such a bright boy." Richard glanced at the papers in her hand. "Mrs. Margaret, can I give you some advice about these investments?" "Oh, I don't understand any of that, but the young lady at the bank said it's a good deal." "Ma'am, promise me you'll think it over before investing all your savings. Sometimes banks, well, what they say isn't always what's best for the customer." Mrs. Margaret looked at him fondly. "You were always such a thoughtful boy. All right, I'll think about it." After she left, Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, processing everything that had happened. His former teacher, the woman who had shaped his childhood, was being robbed at her own bank. That night, Richard came home deeply upset. His wife, Catherine, immediately sensed something was wrong. "Honey, what happened? You look terrible." Richard glanced around the luxurious home they lived in, nestled in the most upscale neighborhood of Cincinnati. The expensive furniture, the artwork, the meticulously kept garden, all paid for with the bank's money. "Catherine, I need to tell you something." He recounted everything he had witnessed over the past 2 days, the elderly woman being forced out of the restroom, the humiliation of humble customers, the scam pulled on Mrs. Margaret. Catherine listened in silence, but her reaction wasn't what Richard had expected. "Honey, you're overreacting. Banks have to turn a profit. You can't treat everyone the same." "What do you mean we can't treat everyone the same?" "Richard, be realistic. A retiree who moves $1,200 a month can't get the same treatment as a business owner who handles millions. It's about economic viability. We're talking about human dignity, Catherine. We're talking about business. You built a successful bank precisely because you knew how to focus on profitable clients." Richard fell silent. Did his own wife really think this way? Had he unknowingly created this culture himself? And this whole disguise as a poor man? "Richard, it's ridiculous. You're a respected businessman, not a beggar. I wanted to understand what our clients go through. Our clients are business owners, doctors, attorneys, not retirees complaining about fees." Richard realized the gap between him and his wife was wider than he'd thought. Catherine sounded just like Jennifer. "I'm going to keep investigating," he said. "Richard, stop this. You have responsibilities to the shareholders, to the employees. Quit playing social hero." That night, Richard barely slept. He felt alone in his own home, questioning everything he'd built. The next day, he decided to visit other branches in disguise. The situation was even worse. At the downtown branch, Richard witnessed an elderly man being pressured into taking out a high-interest loan to cover medical bills. The man clearly couldn't afford it, but the manager insisted it was his only option. At the branch in the working-class neighborhood, Richard saw a single mother being strong-armed into buying an overpriced insurance policy to protect her children. The woman left the bank in tears, barely understanding what she'd signed up for. Every branch followed the same pattern: disdain for the less fortunate, pressure to sell expensive products, and sky-high commissions for employees who met their targets. Richard discovered there was even an internal ranking system. Those who sold the most unnecessary products got bonuses and promotions. Anyone who showed too much concern for clients was reprimanded. The most shocking moment came at the fourth branch he visited. Richard was in line when he overheard two managers talking. "Last week's widow has already lost half her investment," one said, laughing. "The one who put her entire pension into the stock fund. That's the one. She'll be broke in 6 months. At least we hit our quarterly target, the other chuckled. Richard felt sick. They were celebrating an elderly widow's financial ruin. That afternoon, he called an urgent meeting with Walter Scott, his right-hand man for 15 years. Walter was the executive vice president and the person Richard trusted most to oversee the bank's operations. "Walter, I need to understand what's happening in our branches." "What do you mean, Richard? The numbers are great. Record profits for the last 3 quarters. "I'm talking about customer service. Clients are unhappy." Walter, a 52-year-old man with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses, smiled condescendingly. "Richard, you know how it is. Clients always complain, but what matters is the bottom line. Walter, I visited our branches in disguise. I saw things that deeply concerned me." Walter's expression changed instantly. "You did what?" "I posed as a retiree and tested our services. Walter, our employees are humiliating the elderly, selling them products they don't need, turning away poor people from our branches." "Richard," Walter took a deep breath, "you can't do that. Imagine if someone found out the bank's president was pretending to be a beggar. It would be a scandal." "The scandal is what's happening in our branches." "Richard, you're exaggerating. Our employees are trained to maximize results. That's how the competition operates too." "But it doesn't have to be this way." "Yes, it does. Richard, wake up. Do you really think you can compete with the big banks by being nice? They'll swallow you whole." Richard fell silent, processing Walter's words. "Walter, who created these aggressive sales procedures?" They were developed jointly by the sales team." "But who approved them?" Walter hesitated. "Richard, these policies were implemented gradually based on market results. I want to see all the documents for these policies." "Richard, trust me, everything is within legal bounds. I'm not questioning legality, I'm questioning ethics." "Ethics don't pay the bills, Richard. Do you want to see our bank fail because of scruples?" Richard left the meeting even more troubled. Walter, his trusted right-hand man, sounded just like Jennifer and Catherine. Did everyone around him think this way? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. In the following days, Richard intensified his investigation. He discovered a commission system that rewarded employees for selling unsuitable products to vulnerable clients. He found that complaints were systematically ignored or buried. He even uncovered deals with loan sharks operating inside the branches. But the most shocking discovery came when he found an internal document on Walter's computer, a manual titled "Profit Maximization with Low-Income Clients." The document taught employees how to identify lonely retirees, vulnerable widows, and financially struggling individuals to push legal but unethical schemes. The manual had been developed by an external consulting firm, but was approved and implemented by Walter. Richard realized his partner had created a systematic scheme to exploit the most vulnerable. That night, Richard decided to confront Walter directly. "Walter, I found the manual on exploiting the elderly." Walter paled. "Richard, it's not like that." "Not like what?" "It says right here. Lonely seniors are more susceptible to insurance products. Emphasize the vulnerability of old age." "This is disgusting." "Richard, all banks do this. It's market strategy." "I don't want my bank doing this." "Your bank?" "Richard, you may be the president, but you're not the sole owner. We have other shareholders to answer to." The threat was clear. Walter was reminding Richard he didn't have full control. "Walter, we're stopping these practices immediately." "Richard, if we do that, our profits will plummet. The shareholders won't accept it. Then we'll find other ways to make a profit." "Richard," Walter stood and walked to the window. "You're having a midlife crisis. It'll pass." "This isn't a midlife crisis, it's a conscience." "It's naivety." "Richard, you built this bank from scratch. You're not going to destroy it now over a few old folks complaining about fees." Richard realized the battle would be harder than he imagined. Walter wasn't just his employee. He was a minority partner and had influence over other shareholders. The next day, Richard decided to speak individually with employees from different branches. He wanted to understand if they all condoned the abusive practices or if some were just victims of the system. His first conversation was with Brandon, the young employee who tried to help customers. "Brandon, can I speak with you privately?" "Of course, sir." They sat at the cafe around the corner from the branch. "Brandon, are you happy working at the bank?" The young man hesitated. "Why do you ask, sir?" "I've noticed you treat customers differently than the other employees." Brandon lowered his head. "Sir, can I trust you?" "Of course. I hate what I'm forced to do. I have to push expensive products on people who can barely afford basic bills. But if I don't, I'm fired." "How do you put up with it?" "I have a little girl, sir. I need this job. But every night I go to bed with a guilty conscience." "What about the other employees? Do they think like you?" "Some do. Others have gotten used to it. And there are those who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing, like Jennifer." Brandon made a face. "Jennifer is complicated. She wasn't like this when she started at the bank." "What do you mean?" "When she was hired 8 years ago, she was a normal person. But the system changed her. If you didn't sell, you were humiliated. If you did sell, you were rewarded. Over time, she became what she is now." Richard realized the problem was more complex than he'd thought. The system had corrupted people who might have been decent originally. "Brandon, if you could change anything about the bank, what would it be?" "First, I'd get rid of these ridiculous sales targets. Second, I'd train employees to actually help customers, not exploit them. Third, I'd treat every customer with dignity, no matter how much money they have." Richard smiled. Brandon thought exactly like he did. "Brandon, what if I told you it's possible to change all this?" "Sir, with all due respect, you're a retired client. How are you going to change an entire bank?" Richard almost revealed his identity, but decided to wait for the right moment. In the following days, Richard spoke with other employees. He discovered that about 40% of them were unhappy with the bank's practices, but stayed silent out of fear of losing their jobs. Another 30% had adjusted to the system, and the remaining 30% genuinely believed pressuring seniors into expensive products was helping them live a better life. Richard also found out there was a climate of fear in the branches. Employees who questioned the practices were either transferred to bad locations or simply fired. Walter had created a network of loyal managers who reported any inappropriate behavior from subordinates. The situation reached its breaking point when Richard witnessed the most outrageous scene of all. Mrs. Edith Johnson, a 68-year-old widow, had come to the bank to withdraw her pension. She was approached by a consultant who convinced her to invest all her money in an extremely risky stock fund. "Mrs. Edith, you're going to be rich," the consultant said. "In 6 months, this pension will double." "But what if I lose the money?" the widow asked, worried. "Impossible, Mrs. Edith. It's a bank-guaranteed investment." Richard knew that was a criminal lie. The fund had an extremely high chance of loss, and no investment was guaranteed. Mrs. Edith signed the papers with tears in her eyes, clearly uncertain but trusting the employee's word. 2 weeks later, Richard learned Mrs. Edith had lost 70% of her invested money. She returned to the bank in despair, asking to undo the investment. "It can't be undone, Mrs. Edith," Jennifer said coldly. "You signed the contract. You knew the risks." "But he said it was guaranteed." "Mrs. Edith, investments are never guaranteed. It's written in the contract." "I don't understand all that fine print." "You tricked me." "Ma'am, no one tricked anyone. You just didn't read it carefully." Richard, who was watching the scene in disguise, saw Mrs. Edith leave the bank in tears. She had lost her lifelong pension by trusting dishonest employees. That's when Brandon approached Mrs. Edith on the sidewalk. "Mrs. Edith, wait a moment." "What is it, son?" Brandon looked around, making sure no one was watching, and pulled an envelope from his pocket. "Mrs. Edith, this is for you." "What is this?" "It's money. It's not much, but it'll help you get through the month." "Son, I can't take your money." "Yes, you can, Mrs. Edith. You were tricked. It's not fair." Richard saw that Brandon had given his own savings to Mrs. Edith. The young man had done what Richard wished he could have done. The next day, Brandon was called into Walter's office. "Brandon, I heard you gave money to a client who lost money on investments. How did you find out?" "It doesn't matter how. What matters is you're interfering with the bank's business." "Mr. Walter, she was clearly deceived. Brandon, clients are responsible for their own decisions. It's not our job to cover their losses." "But Mr. Walter, she's an elderly woman. She doesn't understand investments." "That's exactly why she signed a liability waiver. Brandon, you're fired." "What?" "Hand over your badge and materials. Security will escort you out." Richard watched as Brandon was humiliated and thrown out for doing the right thing. That was the last straw. That night, Richard decided it was time to act. But first, he needed to understand exactly who was behind it all. He remotely hacked into Walter's computer and found a series of incriminating emails. Walter wasn't just implementing abusive practices, he was receiving personal commissions from third-party companies selling unsuitable financial products to the elderly. It was a corruption scheme far worse than Richard had imagined. Walter was getting rich off the suffering of the most vulnerable. Richard also discovered that Walter had been manipulating reports to hide customer complaints. There were over 1,000 formal complaints in the last 2 years, but none had reached Richard's attention. Even worse, Walter was plotting to remove Richard as the bank's president. He had been talking to minority shareholders, claiming Richard was getting sentimental and hurting the business. Richard realized he had to act fast before Walter could take control. He scheduled an emergency board meeting for the following week, claiming he had important strategic matters to discuss. But Richard knew he couldn't face Walter alone. He needed allies. His first ally was a surprise Catherine. "Richard, I've thought a lot about our conversation," she said one morning. "Maybe you're right." "How so?" "I went to the bank yesterday to resolve an issue with my business account. I saw how they treat ordinary people. It's truly degrading." Richard felt relieved. Maybe Catherine could see beyond the numbers. "Catherine, I need your help. I'm going to confront Walter at the board meeting, but he has influence over some shareholders. You can count on me." Richard also sought out employees unhappy with the bank's practices. Besides Brandon, who was now unemployed, he found 12 more employees willing to publicly expose what was happening. The final piece of the puzzle came when Richard discovered that Mrs. Margaret had consulted an attorney after losing half her savings in the guaranteed investment Jennifer had sold to her. Richard sought out the attorney, Attorney Howard Mitchell, and introduced himself. "Attorney Howard, I'm Richard Thompson, president of the bank where Mrs. Margaret was wronged." "Mr. Thompson, what a surprise. I was actually coming to speak with you." "I wanted to speak with you as well. I want to compensate Mrs. Margaret and all the other clients who were deceived." "Mr. Thompson, you do realize this could cost the bank millions?" "I know, and I'm willing to pay." The attorney was taken aback by Richard's honesty. "May I ask why you're doing this?" Richard told the whole story. The disguise, the discoveries, his outrage at the abusive practices. "Attorney Howard, I need your help to sue my own vice president for corruption and to compensate all the wronged clients." "Mr. Thompson, this is very brave, but you do realize you could lose control of the bank. I'd rather lose the bank than remain complicit in these practices." The attorney agreed to help Richard, impressed by his determination. On the day of the board meeting, Richard had carefully prepared his strategy. He had recordings of the abusive practices, incriminating emails from Walter, and the support of employees and wronged clients. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. The meeting took place in the bank's conference room, with all 7 board members present. Besides Richard and Walter, there were 5 external shareholders. "Esteemed board members," Richard began, "I've called this meeting to address serious irregularities in our operations." Walter smiled nervously. "Richard, if this is about the quarterly numbers, I can explain." "It's not about numbers, Walter. It's about ethics." Richard began presenting the evidence. First, he showed the recordings of abusive practices in the branches. The board members watched in silence as scenes played out of elderly customers being humiliated and deceived. "Richard," one shareholder said, "these practices are regrettable, but they're not illegal." "They may not be illegal, but they're immoral," Richard replied. "And there's more." He then presented Walter's emails revealing the kickback and corruption scheme. Walter wasn't just implementing abusive practices, he was personally profiting from them. Walter tried to defend himself. "Richard, this is taken out of context. Walter, you turned our bank into a machine for exploiting the elderly and vulnerable. And on top of that, you were making money under the table." The tension in the room was palpable. The board members whispered among themselves. "Mr. Thompson," the senior board member said, "these are very serious accusations. Do you have concrete proof?" Richard presented all the documents, the illegal commissions, the doctored reports, the hidden complaints. "And there's one more thing," Richard said. "Walter was planning to remove me as president." He showed the emails where Walter discussed with shareholders the need for a leadership change. Walter made one last attempt. "Board members, Richard is clearly in crisis. He disguised himself as a beggar, abandoned his executive duties, and is obsessed with trivial matters. He's no longer fit to lead this bank." "Trivial?" Richard stood up. "Walter, is human dignity trivial?" "Richard, dignity doesn't pay dividends." The silence that followed was deafening. Walter had revealed his true nature in front of everyone. The vote was close, but Richard won 4-3. Walter was stripped of all his positions and would face corruption charges. But Richard's victory was just the beginning. Now he needed to completely rebuild the bank's culture. His first move was to reinstate Brandon and promote him to Director of Ethics. His second step was to fire all managers who had condoned abusive practices, including Jennifer. "Mr. Richard," Jennifer said when she was called in to talk, "I was just doing my job. Jennifer, your job was to help customers, not exploit them." "But the targets, the numbers, the targets have changed, Jennifer. Now the goal is customer satisfaction, not profit at any cost." Jennifer couldn't adapt to the new model and was let go. But Richard offered career reassistance and an ethics retraining course for all employees who wanted to change. His third measure was to create a compensation fund for all harmed customers. Richard invested $5 million of his own money to repair the damages. Mrs. Margaret was one of the first to be compensated. "Richard, my son," she said when he revealed his identity, "I always knew you had a good heart. Mrs. Margaret, forgive me for letting this happen." "Son, what matters is that you fixed it. I've always been proud to have been your teacher." Richard cried as he hugged Mrs. Margaret. The woman who had taught him life's first lessons was forgiving his failures as a businessman. Mrs. Edith was also compensated and even got a job at the bank as a senior relations consultant. "Mr. Richard," she said, "I want to help other seniors avoid what I went through." The bank's transformation wasn't easy. Profits dipped in the first quarter, making shareholders nervous. "Richard," Catherine said, "the numbers are worrying." "Catherine, we're investing in change. The results will come." And they did. By the second quarter, even with lower absolute profits, customer satisfaction soared. New clients began seeking out the bank, drawn by its reputation for fair treatment. Richard implemented a revolutionary model. Employees were now rewarded for solving customer problems, not pushing products. Branches became financial education centers. Seniors received priority service and free consultations. The bank created tailored products for each customer profile, always prioritizing their benefit over institutional profit. Richard's story spread through the media. Journalists came from across the country to see the bank that put ethics above profit. "Mr. Thompson," one reporter asked, "aren't you afraid competitors will destroy your model?" "On the contrary," Richard replied, "I hope they copy it. The whole United States would benefit." 6 months after the transformation, Richard's bank became a national benchmark for compassionate service. Other institutions began revising their practices, pressured by ethical competition. Brandon, now ethics director, created a training program adopted by banks nationwide. He became a sought-after speaker, always sharing how the courage of one retired customer changed an entire institution. The lesson we learned: Brandon said in his talks, is never to underestimate the power of someone determined to do what's right. Richard resumed disguising himself periodically, no longer to investigate, but to ensure the transformation was real and lasting. Each time, he left proud of what he saw. During one visit, he witnessed a scene that moved him deeply. An elderly woman arrived at the bank struggling to walk. Immediately, 3 employees stepped up to help. One brought a chair, another fetched water, and the third sat beside her, patiently explaining every available option. "Ma'am, don't worry about rushing," said the employee. "Let's take our time until you understand everything clearly." Richard smiled. That was the culture he had always dreamed of for his bank. Richard's personal transformation was also profound. He discovered that true satisfaction didn't come from astronomical profits, but from knowing his work improved people's lives. Catherine, initially resistant, became one of the strongest advocates of the new model. "Richard," she said one evening, "I've never seen you so happy." "Catherine, I finally found the purpose of my work." "What is it?" "To make people feel respected and cared for, no matter how much money they have." Richard's bank inspired broader change in the US financial sector. Laws were passed to protect the elderly from abusive practices. Regulators created stricter rules for financial products targeting vulnerable individuals. Richard was invited to testify before Congress about ethical practices in the financial system. "Honorable representatives," he said, "a bank can be profitable without being predatory. The proof is that our financial results today are better than ever, precisely because we've earned our customers' genuine trust." The story gained international attention. Richard was invited to speak in other countries, always sharing the message that business success and social responsibility could coexist. But the greatest reward came unexpectedly. A year after the transformation, Richard received a handwritten letter. It was from Mrs. Margaret. "My dear student Richard, I always knew you would do important things in life, but I never imagined something as beautiful as this. You turned a place of suffering into a place of dignity. Yesterday I went to the bank and the miss treated me like a queen. She explained everything patiently, offered me coffee, asked about my health, and even gave me a special discount because I'm retired. I left feeling like an important person, not a burden. Thank you for remembering the lessons I tried to teach in school, to treat everyone with respect and kindness. You'll always be my favorite student. With love, Margaret Wilson." Richard kept that letter as his greatest treasure. It summed up everything he had achieved through his transformation. 2 years later, Richard's bank became the most admired in the country, not just for its financial results, but for the ethical revolution it had sparked across the industry. Richard still disguised himself occasionally, but now purely for the joy of seeing the results of his change. Every visit confirmed the transformation had taken deep root. During one such visit, he overheard a conversation that filled him with pride. "Mum," a young woman told her elderly mother, "here at Richard's bank you don't have to worry, they treat you like family." "It's true, dear. Here, I feel at home." Richard smiled under his cap. Richard's bank had become the affectionate name customers used for the institution. The transformation had gone beyond business. Richard had discovered his true calling wasn't just making money, it was making a difference in people's lives. Today, when Richard tells his story, he always ends with the same reflection. "The greatest lesson I learned is that true success isn't measured just in profits, but in the positive impact we have on others' lives. When I disguised myself as a retiree, I wasn't just testing my bank, I was rediscovering my humanity." Brandon, who now oversees ethics for several banks, always adds, "And the lesson I learned is that one person can make a difference, even when it seems like they're standing alone against the system." Mr. Richard proved that courage and determination can change any reality. The story of Richard's bank became a case study in universities around the world. But for Richard, the most important thing wasn't the awards or recognition. The most important thing was knowing that every morning, thousands of people walked into his bank's branches and left feeling respected and valued, regardless of their social or financial status. Richard had transformed not just a company, but an entire vision of how business can and should be conducted. And it all started with a man brave enough to disguise himself and see reality through the eyes of those who needed dignity and respect the most. End of story. Now, what did you think of this transformation? Do you believe it's possible to balance profit with ethics in business? Have you ever been in similar situations at banks, or know someone who was mistreated for being considered a worthless customer? Share your experience in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one.